Hi, everybody. I'm Pete Christensen.
And I'm Coffee Brown.
And this is Don't Die Dumb. Now, today's episode, I'd like to start out by talking about an amazingly disgusting thing that actually happened. Brian Kilmeade, and I presume I'm pronouncing his name correct, on Fox News stated, and this isn't an exact quote, but it's very close, maybe we should have the mentally ill homeless involuntarily, lethally injected. Now, since then, he's been walking it back, saying, I didn't mean to imply it. No, you said it. You knew what you were saying. You're not a dumb man. You're an adult. You said it.
And that is not the first time I've heard that from a maggot either.
Really?
So that comment has come up a few times. I read an interesting comment on Reddit where somebody said, to be a maggot, you have to have the personality of a concentration camp guard. It's getting that way. In the red states, they show videos of the police, of ICE tear gassing an elementary school. And in the blue states, they go, oh, that's horrible. And in the red states, they go, I voted for that. Really? I mean, it's one thing to say uncontrolled immigration is an issue. It's another to say randomly rounding up elementary school kids because they have olive skin. That's kind of going far.
Now, before Jimmy Carter was out of office, he set up 1,000, I think we touched on this on an earlier broadcast, walk-in mental health clinics around the nation. Ronald Reagan came in and closed them all down. And now there are 65,000 homeless in Los Angeles alone. 65,000. That's a large town of homeless. Now, people will say, well, they're homeless because they want to be or they won't work. 20% are children.
Well, Pete and I have both been homeless at different times in history. And both of us went on to have successful careers. That is the rule rather than the exception. The average time that people are homeless is about 3 months. It's not the sort of chronic voluntary condition that so many on the right seem to think it is.
There was a school in Phoenix, Arizona, and the woman that was running it made sure kids could come in, get a shower, get a meal, and get clean clothes if they needed clean clothes, or if their clothes were torn, they could get new clothes. Then they go to class, they get a free lunch, and then they got a snack to eat on the way home or to take home. And this was one way to get people, the next generation, out of being homeless, because then they were ready for high school or trade school. And what happened was, she was not a good administrator. She didn't know how to do this. So the state closed her down. Even with being a bad administrator, it was still better than the alternative. No school, no meals at all.
So school nutrition helps get kids in to get an education, which in turn helps to make sure that they can earn their way later in life and not be homeless. And the schools, the requirement for education, helps get kids in to get nutrition, which in turn helps to reduce the likelihood that later in life they'll have brain damage from malnutrition. And so again, they can function better in society. All of us should be invested in all children. The pro-lifers need to remember that life doesn't end at birth.
Now, quite often, the homeless start fires to stay warm, and that results in businesses being burnt down and houses being burnt down, usually abandoned houses. And they always claim that it's crack addicts doing this. I don't believe it. In some cases it is, but the majority, no. I just think they're trying to stay warm.
So my own building has had a couple of fires built on the porch, and a couple of them actually charred the outer wall, and therefore could have been, certainly were fire risks. But I go down and sort of escort these people off the property, and they weren't high on anything. They were cold, miserable people with no home who were looking for a way to stay warm for the night. And I felt kind of bad moving them along. Nevertheless, I have to protect the building. Homelessness is a problem, but blaming the homeless is the least productive way we could possibly attack the problem.
Well, that's become very popular. Let's blame the victim.
Sure, they're ugly, they're smelly, they don't have good teeth, they come up and panhandle you. It's easy to blame them unless you yourself have ever been homeless. And to double down and say, well, let's take the homeless mentally ill and euthanize them, well, I guarantee in your family there are some mentally ill people, and almost certainly in your family and in your circle, there are people who are now or have been homeless. And I've met a lot of homeless people who are very nice people, who are just victims. They're scared. They're trying to get shelter. So there are your belligerent homeless. They certainly do exist, but they are far from representative.
Now, let me give you my idea, and you can put this down if you want, of course, because I'm just spitballing here. We have a big area, whatever you need for your town. There are, I believe, 6,000 homeless in Albuquerque. You make 4 of them, one on each side of town, north, south, east, and west. Cyclone fences to protect them. You let people go in at night to sleep. Overhead would be solar panels, which would produce heat in the winter and a fan in the summer. And each person would have a stall, and you divide them up into men, women with children, and a 4th category for anybody who comes in drunk or high. And you let them stay there at night with a stall connecting for their belongings. And you have porta potties there and an armed guard to make sure that it's run safely.
Essentially hostels. And basically, I've pitched the same thing myself multiple times in the past. But I want to talk about some of the reasons why that's not as easy as it sounds. On the one hand, it's generally cheaper for cities to do that. And of course, you can bring social services there. You can bring medical care, psychiatric services, social services of all kinds into this same place. So why wouldn't the homeless want to go there? Well, some of them won't take people whose hygiene is worse than some threshold, or won't take people who are using alcohol or drugs, which is pretty common among the homeless. Frankly, it's common among people who live in penthouses too.
Yeah.
It just isn't as unseemly when they do it. And oftentimes the homeless are afraid of each other, and of course they're often afraid of guards. In the current environment, for example, a person who was both an immigrant and homeless would probably be rounded up by ICE. And in fact, because the Supreme Court has allowed racial profiling, just having an accent or olive skin and being homeless could be enough to make such a shelter unsafe for you, because ICE does not follow due process. They round people up without charges, without probable cause, and hold them for indefinite periods without due process of the law. That's the next thing we should talk about, is due process. But today
Yes.
we're on homeless.
There are 61,000, and we won't go further on 61,000, this is a ballpark figure, people who are now in private prisons simply because they were picked up. Why can't
It's much, much cheaper to have a hostel than to put people in prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And prisons don't return people to work, whereas the social services and the like potentially can.
well, now, why can't people sue ICE for kidnapping?
Because we no longer have rule of law. I mean, we have a system of courts that doesn't care that ICE isn't following legal procedure. And the public's okay. So we are on now on proper procedure, and the public is thinking, well, if they're an illegal immigrant, they're not entitled to the protections that a citizen would have. Okay, let's go with that for a minute. And there's some problems there, but let's go with that for a second. We don't know if they are an illegal immigrant until they get due process. Some of them have been arrested on their way to their hearings. They were following the legal process. They went down to make their case, to get their visa or whatever, or their refugee status. And on their way to their hearings, they've been rounded up by ICE, and then they lose their legal status because they missed their hearings. Or some of them simply have an accent. They could be, here in New Mexico, there's a lot of fifth-generation Americans who still have Hispanic accents. That's not a good enough reason to round them up and deprive them of due process. Or the police are stopping people on street corners and saying, prove your citizenship. Can you do that? You may think that your white skin and your lack of an accent would be enough of a warrant, and with profiling, it might be. But if it's not, you're going to jail.
People think it can happen to them, it can't happen to you. Why couldn't it? It could happen to any of us.
I mean, John Oliver was afraid it would happen to him because he's British.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there have been a number of Norwegians this year who were deported.
Mm-hmm.
So having white skin will not protect you from ICE. Not having an accent will not protect you from ICE. And you've either been the person or heard somebody say to an Asian, well, where are you really from? And they're like, I'm third generation American or fifth generation American. Yeah, but where are you really from? I'm really from Poughkeepsie or from West Texas or something. Yeah, but where are you really from? What they mean is, of what extraction are you? But that's a very different question. Of what extraction are you? You look at me and you think I'm Anglo. I'm not. I'm Celtic. What's yours?
Norwegian and Native American.
Okay, so, this whole profiling thing is a mistake. The point of due process is people aren't guilty till they're guilty. We saw the same thing in the Iraq War. We justified rounding up people because as a young male in a space we had invaded, they are likely enough to be terrorists that they have no protection from torture. We can torture them. That was all the due process they got. Well, you know who lives in Iraq? Iraqis. And you know what most of them are doing? They're making drugs or farming plants or raising children or goats or sheep or something. And rounding them up and torturing them because, they could be terrorists. Yeah, they could be. So could you.
So, rounding back to the subject of homelessness.
Well, they touched on the due process thing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So that part of it was about due process for the homeless. Back to homeless.
Now, you notice they are abducting, kidnapping anyone without skin, but they're not doing that to the homeless. And the reason is, in my opinion, because such a good majority of the homeless are mentally ill, that not a majority, but a good percentage, they can't get them to work for free. They're going into, I think they're going to be using these people that they rounded up, immigrants, for free labor. As more and more farms go out of business, industrialists pick them up and
we can go full boogie Nazi and just work them to death, and then they'll never come back.
Yeah. So how can the average person, number one, how can we help people not become homeless? So one of the reasons for so much homelessness is that we're all working paycheck to paycheck. In college, the teacher went around the room and asked everybody, what is your goal? Anybody, I want to be a captain of industry, I want to be a fashion designer, and they came to me and I said, I want to get myself out of the workforce as quick as humanly possible. And the teacher stopped and said, that guy, he pointed to me, he said, in 30 years, he's the first guy to get it. He said, this system is set up to work you till you're too old to work anymore. And at that point, you're finally free. But because everyone's working paycheck to paycheck, there is no age where you're too old to work anymore. I realized the system was rigged years ago. Most people don't get it, this whole American work ethic. What is that? You think Elon Musk has the American work ethic? You think he wants to be on the assembly line? And with the tech coming in, Barack Obama warned people about this. These low manufacturing jobs are not coming back because they can get people in India to do it for 11 cents an hour.
And if they did, they would come back at below a living wage. So you mentioned, working. Well, besides the fact that unemployment is starting to creep up again and that layoffs are becoming popular again, there's the fact that wages are so low. I was shocked to hear that most of the people I see in tent cities have jobs. But the jobs don't pay enough to pay rent, which is why a living wage, not minimum wage, but a living wage indexed to the regional cost of living and to inflation must be the bottom allowable legal wage. Because right now we have people working full-time, but they're homeless, and your taxes are subsidizing their meals and their health care and so forth, which you're resenting. That's why you voted maggot, right? Well, if you don't want your tax dollars to go to that, stop subsidizing Walmart and subsidizing sharecropper farmers and so forth to pay less than a living wage. Insist that employers pay people enough to live on. If people who have jobs are in tents, you are subsidizing their employer, not that person, the employer.
Now, tell me if this is true. And I don't know the facts on this, just what I've been hearing from numerous people. Walmart gets a $4,000 bump every time they hire someone from low income. and yet they don't make enough to live on, so we're subsidizing Walmart, because this comes out of taxes.
Exactly. That's exactly right. We're subsidizing Walmart. That's my point. And not just Walmart. I don't mean to single out Walmart. And in fact, I shop there and so forth. But so long as it's permissible to pay less than a living wage, Walmart has to pay less than a living wage because we all shop there for low prices. In order for Walmart to survive, everybody has to pay a living wage. One of the things we forget in America, where we chafe at rules all the time, oh, regulations, oh, they bother me so much, is that regulations can sometimes free us. Consider, slight tangent, but it's on topic. Consider a paper mill that's dumping mercury into the river next to it. Mercury which damages the kids downstream. Think Flint, Washington. That's not exactly how that happened, but pretty close. And to get all the lead in their water. Flint, Michigan. Yeah. Flint, Michigan, I meant to say. So think of that kind of situation, okay? Well, we'd like to tell this company, don't dump toxic waste into the water that people drink out of. And the company is thinking, yeah, we don't really want to do that. But if we don't, and the other guy doesn't have the same rule, he'll undercut us and we'll go out of business. Some rules can only be followed if everybody has the same rules. Imagine playing chess. If my queen can do a nuclear missile attack, cross the board and kill your king, but you don't get the same rule. Unless we all have the same rules and the rules are enforced, sometimes we're not free to do things we want to do.
Well, that was Reagan's whole point years ago. Well, the scariest words in the English language are the phrases, I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help you. We got to cut down the Fed. Well, what I found is Doge didn't reduce the money from government. What they did was they cut social programs.
But they did use that money to invade our own cities with our own army, which until now has been illegal and unconstitutional. But with this bootlicking Supreme Court, he can do things that violate every norm America has ever had.
I don't mind the armed services coming into my area if they in fact go into the gang-infested areas. Most of these guys were out, and women, were out cleaning the parks because they wouldn't send them into a gang-infested area. They're afraid to have a shootout with the gangs. So I'm paying to have these guys patrol the parks and hassle innocent people? That's ridiculous.
I do mind that. And in fact, if we were to do that at all, the National Guard would probably be a better choice than the Army.
Yeah, of course they would.
But the idea of, if they were deployed under the direction of the police after investigation has shown that there's a specific reason to hit a certain area to get a certain gang, I mean, that would be a different planet than the one that we live on. Just sending huge armies of people into states because they voted for Democrats is insane. It's just insane. And I'd say the same thing if Biden had sent armies into red states and red cities. That would be just as crazy, and I'd be making the exact same noises.
So what's the way to break the cycle of homeless? Homeless people
pay
have children.
People a living wage. Pay a living wage. And also make these hostels safe enough that the homeless aren't afraid to go there, and don't have standards that are unreasonable for homeless people. They're going to smell bad. Send them to, let them take a shower. Not a German shower, a real shower, okay? And, help them to, and keep them safe. Have enough security there to keep them safe. That would be a good use of security. But again, we don't need the National Guard. We have police, and we could have community security.
The argument against this is if you have a national minimum wage, then all the businesses are going to have to jack up their prices. And subsequently, it's just the inflationary spiral is going to go nuts.
Thank you. I've been wanting to circle back to that since our first podcast.
Yes.
It is true that if we had, I wouldn't say minimum wage.
That's
a specific term that isn't working. Okay, but if we had a national living wage and people could afford to buy food and shelter and things like that, it would tend to drive a wage price spiral. So we do have to account for that from the beginning. The Fed is one of the instruments we can use. Conceivably, some kinds of price control. I know that's a dirty word, but hey, we're already on tariffs. It's too late for dirty words, right? So some form of price control might make sense. And bringing back laws against usury and profiteering, which were dumped during the Reagan administration, those would be some of the things we could do to mitigate a wage price spiral. But it's absolutely true that if we go down the path I recommend, which is a living wage, we do have to have controls in place to prevent triggering a wage price spiral.
Now, if you're on Social Security, you can get into public housing, which is 1/3 of your payments go for your housing, no matter if your payments are $800 a month or your payment might be $1,500 a month. 1/3 goes for your housing, you can spend the rest. And you're okay in your old age. Now, when they had public housing for the poor years ago, or as they're known, the projects, what would happen? They become crime-ridden, terribly crime-ridden. And conservatives will say, well, yeah, look what happened with Bonnie Haim in Chicago, or these other projects that they have. How do you confront that?
There's a group of there's a place that publishes college lectures called The Great Courses. Highly recommend them to everybody, and I spend a lot of my time listening to these college lectures from The Great Courses. One of them is on the Victorian era, and one of the things they discuss in detail is the Irish potato famine. The reason I mention that here is it's the very beginning of what we would now call a welfare system. More than half of the Irish, around half of the Irish, starved to death. In fact, there are more Irish living in America than there are in Ireland because of the mass emigration that the potato famine caused. So England, some do-gooders in England prevailed upon the British government to help the Irish by sending them bushels of food and things like that. Now, what they sent was meager in the extreme. And the conditions were that if you owned land in Ireland, you had to give them your entire farm to get a bushel of food. Many, many, many Irish farmers,
Wow.
10th generation Irish farmers, lost their land, lost their home, lost everything so that they could survive for another few weeks on this one bushel of food they had to trade away. And the Brits were complaining that, oh, this is just too high a price to pay. They made out like bandits. They got back value thousands to one, greater than what they were donating to the Irish. This kind of mentality that people who receive help are freeloaders is a big part of why maggots hate welfare systems. First of all, the word welfare is in the Constitution because it is actually part of the role of the government. It's what the government was established for. Of course, now that we're getting rid of the Constitution, that may not matter, but that was where it originally came from. But second of all, when you rehabilitate people, so I was on food stamps for about 3 months. I was homeless for about 9 months. I say I, my wife and I together were. Then I went on and went to medical school and paid lots of taxes, and society has made back thousands of times what it put into me by supporting me through that rough period. That story is more the rule than the exception. Most people are only homeless for a period of their life, and then they go back to working. But if they die or become crippled or become hopeless or become alcoholics while they're homeless, we don't get them back again. So I'm not making I do believe there's a moral case to be made about the homeless, but that's not the case I'm making here. The case I'm making here is if you want the economy to thrive, don't throw people away, rematriculate them to participate in the economy as both producers and consumers.
Well, under the past Democratic administration, they wanted to give everyone free trade school, 2-year trade school. And people were outraged by that because they said, I paid for college, you got to pay for college. Why should you get a free ride? I will never understand the attitude of I got mine, now screw you. You can't have yours. But that's very prevalent, even among people that call themselves liberal.
Well, it's actually commonly the case that the far right and the far left create the same sabotage. You mentioned homeless being turned out on the streets because Ronald Reagan closed down so many facilities. But during the same period, Democrats wanted to close down a lot of these facilities on the ground that people should be free to be a schizophrenic person bonking their head on a brick wall in the middle of the street. So some people who need help aren't getting it because it's a violation of their individual rights. And that is a tricky area. Nowadays that I work as an ethicist, that is tricky. But the point is that whether we turn them out on the street because we don't want to constrain them, or we turn them out on the street because we don't want to support them, they wind up mentally ill people on the street suffering horribly, and nobody raises their hand to be mentally ill. Being mentally ill is not the fault of that person. It's an iffier case where substance abuse is involved, but most people who are lifelong substance abusers start in their mid-teens. And we all know that a teenager just doesn't have good judgment. So this is a trap teenagers fall into, and if you made it through your teens without doing anything stupid, please send us a letter so we can call you a liar.
Well, is there a housing system we could set up for the homeless?
Yes, it has to have adequate security. If you're going to send the police, a high-density police presence into high-density potential crime areas, I would say housing for the homeless is one of the places to start. In the past, we've just simply warehoused the homeless, and we don't really care what happens to them. We look the other way. I remember when I first did a outing on an ambulance in Oakland, California. We were driving through this neighborhood. There were no doors in the doorways, and there were no glass in the windows, and there was soot around all the window frames that had no glass in them. And I said to the guys, what happened here? Was there a disaster of some sort? Was there a big fire? And where is everybody? And they said, all of these places you see, they're inhabited. The smoke you see is because they have no power. They're burning fires in there to stay warm. And the reason there's no glass or doors is that if people put those in, they'll get vandalized the very next day. And also it's a signal to the gangs that someone lives there. So they'll come in and rob who's ever there. So we blame the homeless for destroying their own environment, when in fact there's nothing they'd like better than to have a safe environment. But we let the gangs go in because we don't care about these poor, they are not homeless, they have homes actually. Yeah. These low-income housing developments, we see as throwaway people. We ought not to. We ought to protect them, because I lived in barrios and slums for a long time after the homeless period. That was part of coming back into the world. And there were amazing people there. There were people selling arts and crafts. There were these iron moms who made their kids come straight home and do homework after school, and they got out of those environments. There were people who were, in fact, substance abusers or alcoholics, and I sometimes would have to pull them off the street and stuff. But they were kind and warm and pleasant people. And so this notion that because there's vandalism in poor neighborhoods, poor people are vandals is a false equation. Poor people are left by us to the mercy of vandals is the way that I would see it.
I believe that Americans are very generous. They're just not generous with money. We talked about this before. If you have a shoe drive or a coat drive, they get inundated. People will give part of what they have, but they can't afford money, especially now when everything is more expensive, especially rents and buying a house. $500,000 median home price, that's insane. But I say this, if there was, say, on PBS or NPR, a program where you show people and say, who wants to help them in this way or that way, this could help 100% to get these people out of that terrible situation. But there isn't. I don't see why there shouldn't be a national program to try and help people. If you could see the face of homelessness, you'd want to help, I think.
Well, that is a problem, because the face of homelessness is a face that's missing a lot of teeth, that hasn't shaved, hasn't shampooed or shaved in a while, don't have nice clothes, and they have their hand out. They're asking for stuff because they're on survival mode. So the face of homelessness to an American eye often is not a sympathetic face.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all we have time for today. I wish we had more of a solution to this, but if you take the basics of what we said, I'm sure you can come up with an idea that might be very helpful as well.
Well, of course, the new evangelical right would say that empathy is a sin. I'm kind of surprised that anybody thinks Jesus would sign off on that statement, but if you think empathy is a sin, we're on a roll. But if you think empathy is a good thing, we should probably look inside ourselves and find a bit more of it.
I hear that. I'm Pete Christensen.
I'm Coffee Brown.
Remember,
don't die dumb.